Ultimately, goals are a measuring tool. We know whether we're improving at something or whether we're making progress towards a goal by having goals or sub-goals in that second example's case. So with our song sections, it's no different. If we want to know whether our chorus is effective or our verse is effective, it's good to have goals for those sections so that we can look at these goals or think about these goals and say to ourselves, is my chorus effectively doing that? Is my verse effectively doing that? So in this video, we're going to talk about what our second verse goals should be. Overall, if we're being honest, for most of us, probably the second verse is the single most difficult part of a song to write. So hopefully as we talk about these goals, we'll work through that and help make it a little bit easier and less painful to write a good second verse. And if we've ever found ourselves phoning in that second verse, hopefully we will never feel the need to do that again because we have clarity and focus on what it is that our second verse should accomplish. So one of the main goals for our second verse should be to add something new to the story. And a part of the reason for this is actually when it comes to just the three main parts of a song, not including arrangement decisions. So we're talking about chord progression, we're talking about melody, and we're talking about lyrics. The chord progression has already been established by the first verse. The melody has already been established by the first verse. We've already heard that. So the only thing that we can do to really differentiate a second verse from a first verse, again, not including arrangement concepts, is with the lyrics. So one of the biggest mistakes people make is the lyrics actually reiterating the same things that the first verse already said, but often it just does so in a worse manner. And I like to call this a second string verse. And if you're not into sports and don't know what I mean by second string in this case, basically just if you have a first string quarterback, that would mean that that's the quarterback actually out on the field. And your second string quarterback is the person that only is out on the field quarterbacking if the first string quarterback is injured. So basically what I mean by a second string verse is that it's just a worse version of the first verse, and there's no real reason for it to exist because, again, it doesn't bring anything new to the table, it doesn't add anything, it's just a worse version of what we already had. So at that point, we might as well just repeat the first verse instead, and we'd be better off. So there are tons of ways to make sure we're adding to the story and having a meaningful part of the song, and specifically the lyrics in our second verse. But one great way is to simply shift in the timeline. So maybe your first verse and your chorus were basically in the present tense. We can then, in the second verse, either advance the timeline and continue the story, make sure it's progressing, or we can actually go back in time and then sort of basically have a second verse that functions as a prequel, basically, to what happened in the first verse and in the chorus. Another way we can avoid saying the same thing is to express a different sentiment. So if the overall idea of a song is basically could be watered down into "I miss you," and the first verse talked about how you miss her joyful presence and how she lit up a room, then maybe the second verse could cover another side of her that you miss. Maybe the side of her that was really comforting and strong when you needed her to be comforting and strong when you were going through something rough or something like that, because it's two different elements of why it is you ultimately miss her. Another goal for our second verse should be to up the ante. So whatever happened in that first verse, we need to make sure that the second verse adds more gravitas to what's going on in the story. And a helpful way to think through a second verse, at least for me, is to think of it like a second part of a trilogy. So you may have noticed that in a lot of trilogies, the second part is where everything goes wrong. For example, The Empire Strikes Back, the second in the original Star Wars trilogy, is where everything goes wrong. Luke learns that the bad guy is actually his dad, and that the idea that his dad was a Jedi hero is true from a certain point of view. And also he loses his hand, and also he got his butt kicked by the bad guy who is also his father. Like, it couldn't get much worse. Oh, also, Han Solo is frozen and may or may not be dead. So everything went wrong at the end of that movie. And also The Dark Knight. In The Dark Knight, the Joker effectively wins because the Joker gets mostly everything he wants. Sure, the two people on the boats don't blow each other up, and that's helpful, but he does ultimately turn Harvey Dent, the White Knight, into something much darker, and eventually he's killed, and then Gotham loses some faith in the concept of the Batman because he has to basically take the fall for the killing of Harvey Dent, basically, where he preserves Harvey Dent's image. Whatever, we won't get too deep into this, even though I do love both of those movies greatly. But the main idea, right, is that a lot of times in trilogies, the second part is where everything goes wrong. And that's what leads into, the triumphant comeback that happens inevitably in the third part of a trilogy. Well, not inevitably, but most of the time. So in the same way, we might want to do the same thing, or at least have the same idea in mind when it comes to our verses. Because often, if we think of the first verse as the first part of a trilogy and the second verse as the second part, usually the bridge is sort of what wraps up the story. Or sometimes we have a third verse that wraps up the story. So really, our second verse really is sort of the second part of a trilogy or of a 3-act story structure. Either way, even in a 3-act story structure, usually that second part is the rising action and where things tend to go wrong. And of course, there are other ways to effectively up the ante, just like you would in a second movie in a trilogy or second book in a trilogy, or just the rising action of a story. An example of this, let's go Star Wars again. In Attack of the Clones, the second in the prequel trilogy, that's where, by the end of it, now there's actually a galaxy-wide war going on. That wasn't really happening at the beginning of the movie. And at the end of the first movie, sure, there were story elements in place and important pieces being put together that ultimately lead to the Empire. But the real beginning of the emergence of the Empire really starts at the end of the second film, Attack of the Clones. So the ante has risen to oh my goodness, now there's a galactic war going on. So ultimately, it doesn't necessarily matter exactly how we get the effect of upping the ante in that second verse, just like it doesn't necessarily matter in a trilogy how you're upping the ante. It shows up in a whole bunch of different ways depending on the trilogy. But ultimately, what's important is that it feels like the song has more gravitas after that second verse than it had before. And another goal for our second verse is to make sure that it is building and accelerating towards the chorus. When it comes to choruses, often you can just copy and paste them and it will be fine. A lot of times, even in professionally recorded songs, there is no difference between the first, second, and third chorus. All the instruments are the same, everything's the same. And sometimes people go a little over the top and they add another guitar for the final chorus or something like that, which I think is good practice. But frankly, usually choruses are good enough that you could literally copy and paste them and not change anything about any of the choruses, leaving them exactly the same. Second verses don't have that luxury. So how do we make sure we keep that second verse interesting? One of the ways is by building inside of that verse. If there's ever a section that you actually religiously adhere to the concept of add something new to your song every 4 bars, that would be your second verse. Because again, we've already had the first verse. We've already heard this melody. We've already heard this chord progression. Frankly, that was the usually energetic low point of the song. We just came from the chorus. We can't have that second verse after we've just had an exciting chorus feel like a disappointment. So a great way to do that is to make sure we're building, we're adding instruments, and it sort of gives the impression that we're accelerating towards the chorus. So what do I mean by accelerating towards the chorus? What I don't mean is that we're actually increasing the tempo. You don't have to do that. But there are other ways to make it feel like we're accelerating towards the chorus just by changing up how you play your instrument parts. So for example, if at the beginning of your second verse, you just have piano and bass and drums, and then maybe one sort of lonely sounding, pretty sparse lead guitar, if by the end of that verse, you actually have 2 lead guitars playing, and they're both playing pretty fast arpeggios that sort of have this driving sound, that is actually a really effective way to make it sound like it's accelerating towards the chorus. Often, other verses can lean towards not having any feeling of acceleration. It's just maybe, say, an acoustic guitar being strummed while somebody sings. There's not necessarily this feeling of it's building towards something, but we really need to make sure that second verse is feeling like it's building towards something. And a couple of bonus tips here. One bonus tip I would have is to make sure your second verse has a tattoo lyric. And a tattoo lyric is just this concept of a lyric or a couple lines, right? Maybe it's one line, maybe it's two lines that are so profound that you could imagine that somebody might want to tattoo it to their body. We've all seen tattoos of lyrics of our favorite artists, right? Or at least of some artists. Maybe it's not artists you like because maybe you don't like artists that are popular enough to determine that, whatever. You know what I mean. The idea is this a profound line or a profound couple lines that would really stand out to somebody like, oh, wow, that's interesting, that's deep. Make sure to have one of those in your second verse to really hammer home that this second verse is worth listening to and the lyrics have something interesting, new, and different to say that's worth paying attention to and that somebody shouldn't just zone out in between the first chorus and the second chorus. Another bonus tip, sometimes your first verse will be especially long. It will be like 30, 45, 55 seconds. If it's getting closer to a minute, that might be a sign that your second verse should be half the length of your first verse, and your first verse should be a double verse. So make sure that you don't have 2 minutes worth of verses just with your first and second verse. If that's the case, you probably have too much time in your second verse and you should cut it in half. And talking about the arrangement side of things for a second, a great way to make sure that your second verse stands out, you can actually have, if for example, your first verse is basically just a piano and the vocalist. A great way to make sure that second verse stands out, even though, yes, the chord progression is going to be the same as the first verse, and yes, the melody is the same, is to actually not use that instrument used in the first verse at all. Let's take the piano example again. If you have piano throughout that whole first verse, maybe in the second verse, it's just acoustic guitar and a couple of electric guitars. Still playing the same basic progression, but totally different instruments. Or you can just do something where, say, the first verse is acoustic guitar, and then for the second verse, it's electric guitar instead. Now, we also should build on the other things I was talking about, like making sure to layer in instruments and adding a new instrument or changing up an instrument part every 4 bars or so. But ultimately, a really good way to sort of cheat it a little bit and make it even more so that the second verse stands out right away from the first verse is to literally have that first verse that is overly reliant perhaps on a single instrument and is just a vocalist and that one instrument, and then that second verse abandons that instrument completely. Another bonus tip is actually sometimes you can look back to your first chorus to figure out how you can make your second verse better. So a common thing to do is to actually have that first chorus a broken down version of the chorus. So instead of having it an octave up like the other choruses, you actually sing it down an octave. Maybe in that part, if let's say your first verse was just a piano and a vocalist, maybe you keep it just a piano and a vocalist for the first chorus, and the vocalist sings an octave down. That helps make it so that the second chorus is more interesting, and it also helps you to be able to really have build in that second verse, because instead of the energy going from first verse, chorus, and then back down for the second verse, you actually can grow the energy steadily all the way until the second chorus, where you first hear the chorus in all of its arranged glory. And there are a bunch of different ways to do this besides the example I just gave. Some other things you can do is simply to not have the drums come in until the beginning of the second verse, or maybe the bass doesn't come in until the beginning of the second verse. Those are probably the 2 most common things to sort of stay out of the song until that second verse, if they didn't come in already in the chorus. And probably the tip you're going to like the least, but honestly might be the most important, is ultimately second verses just are the hardest section of a song to write, especially lyrically. How do I work with that? I just spend a lot more time on it. It is not uncommon for me to spend as much time on the lyrics of my second verse as I spent on all of the other lyrics combined. That is very common for me, just to make sure that I feel like I got it right, because it is harder. So just be willing to put the time in. Avoid the danger of just sort of being like, it's just a second verse. Nobody likes those anyway. Don't do that. If we think about it as a basic song structure, right? You have verse 1, chorus, verse 2, chorus is repeated, and a bridge. You only have 4 total lyrical song sections. That's it. Your second verse, like it or not, is 25% of the lyrical information in your song. That's an awful lot to phone in. If we're thinking in terms of school, you're guaranteed a C at best on your lyrics if you just phone in and get a 0 on having a terrible second verse. Now, of course, that assumes that the lyrical value of a second verse is equal with a chorus and with a bridge, which I think is, of course, not true, but you get what I'm saying. The moral of this story is, hey, second verse is important. It's 25% of the lyrics of your song, give or take. make sure not to phone it in. A great way to remedy the problems that come with a second verse and how hard it is to write is simply spending more time on it. Speaking of lyrics, if you found this video helpful, something else you may find helpful is my 6-step lyric writing checklist. It walks you through every step I go through when I'm writing lyrics because, frankly, I think a lot of the reason that people dread writing lyrics is because they make it way harder on themselves than it needs to be. Because if you just stare at a blank page and say, improvise poetry, of course that's not going to end well. That wouldn't end well for anyone because most human beings are not capable of such a thing. So instead, if we break it down into smaller, much more easily accomplished steps that also help make it so that we have an eventual end product we can be proud of, because the steps along the way don't matter to the listener, right? So sure, you can take pride, and hey, we all probably have that story where we wrote that lyric in 15 minutes and it was great just the first time we wrote it and we never had to edit. It makes a good story, but ultimately listeners don't really care about that. That doesn't really matter. What matters is that final product. Does it ultimately pass what I like to call the frame test, which basically is just the idea of if you print out your lyrics, put it in a frame and put it on the wall, would it pass as poetry? Are the lyrics worthy and good enough to read and admire and be like, oh, wow, that's pretty good. That's pretty interesting, without the crutch of having a powerful melody and interesting music. Because oftentimes people don't even notice how bad lyrics are just because the melody's catchy or the drum beat is something that they like. But if you strip all that away, what are you left with? Are the lyrics still something that you can be proud of? I don't know about you, but for me, I want my lyrics to be something that I can be proud of, that can pass as poetry, that passed the frame test. And part of the way that I get there is by breaking it down into these 6 steps. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check that out. Link in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. I'll talk to you in the next one.